It seems like every other day there's another headline about Boko Haram launching attacks in Nigeria.
It's definitely been a persistent issue.
It has. But what's really fascinating to me is that the Nigerian army's response goes way beyond the typical military stuff. They're really embracing this whole non-kinetic warfare thing.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about tactics. It's a whole different way of thinking about the problem, really getting to the roots of what causes terrorism.
So just to clarify for our listeners, non-kinetic basically means ditching the bombs and bullets, right?
Exactly. It's recognizing that force alone isn't going to solve the problem. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
You need a different approach.
Exactly.
So instead of just sending in troops, the Nigerian army is focusing on building relationships with people in the communities that are most affected by Boko Haram.
That's a huge part of it. Building trust, showing that they're there to protect and help.
I was reading that they're holding town hall meetings with community leaders and even just everyday folks.
It's all about connecting with people where they are, showing that they're not just an occupying force.
Showing that they're actually invested in the well-being of these communities.
Right. It's like, hey, we're not just here to fight, we're here to help you rebuild your lives.
So it sounds like a key part of this non-kinetic approach is winning hearts and minds.
Absolutely. You have to counter the narratives that groups like Boko Haram are pushing.
Well, how do you do that?
That's where things get really interesting. They're using what are called psychological operations, or psyops.
Psyops. Like mind control stuff.
No, nothing that dramatic. It's more about using communication strategically to influence behavior.
Oh, okay. So kind of like a counter-propaganda campaign.
You can think of it that way. They're
Yeah.
trying to undermine Boko Haram's ideology by spreading messages of peace, tolerance, and unity.
But it's not just about what they're saying, right? It's also about how they're saying it.
You got it. They're using all sorts of creative approaches. Like, they've produced radio dramas with popular actors, even music videos with catchy tunes, all designed to subtly promote their message.
So they're using the same channels that Boko Haram uses, but with a totally different message.
Exactly. And they're being really smart about who delivers that message.
Like who?
They've brought in trusted religious leaders and local influencers, people the communities already respect and listen to.
It makes sense. If you want to reach people, you have to speak their language, both literally and figuratively.
And it's not just about targeting potential recruits either. They're also working to help people who've already been involved with Boko Haram.
Really? So trying to reintegrate them back into society.
Exactly. They have a program called Operation Safe Corridor.
I came across that in my research, but I didn't dig too deep. What's the idea behind it?
It's all about giving former Boko Haram fighters a second chance. They provide vocational training, education, psychological support, all the things they need to turn their lives around.
It sounds like a pretty comprehensive program.
It is, and one of the most successful aspects has been the focus on teaching practical skills. They'll teach them carpentry, tailoring, things like that, skills that can help them find a job, support themselves, and feel like they're contributing to society.
So it's not just about punishment, it's about rehabilitation.
Absolutely. It's recognizing that many of these individuals were coerced or tricked into joining Boko Haram. They were victims too.
And that even those who willingly joined might have become disillusioned with the group's brutality.
Exactly. And by offering them a way out, they're helping to break the cycle of violence.
When you think about it, all of this connects back to the humanitarian crisis the conflict has caused.
Oh, definitely. It's impossible to separate the two.
Yeah.
Millions of people have been displaced, their lives shattered. They need basic necessities like food, shelter, medical care.
And it's the Nigerian army stepping up to fill that gap.
They're distributing aid, setting up camps, providing medical services. They're doing everything they can to alleviate the suffering.
So it's like they're fighting on two fronts, the military front and the humanitarian front.
Exactly. And they're doing it with a limited budget and in a challenging environment. But they're committed to helping their people.
It's a pretty impressive effort. And they're not doing it alone, right?
Oh, no, definitely not. They've partnered with civilian authorities, NGOs, and even the international community.
So it's a truly collaborative effort.
It has to be. No single organization can tackle this kind of problem on their own. It requires a coordinated, multifaceted approach.
So it sounds like they're really trying to cover all the bases. But I can't imagine it's all smooth sailing.
Oh, there are definitely challenges. One of the biggest is resources. They just don't have the funding they need to fully implement all these programs and initiatives.
Right, and even with the best intentions, you can only do so much with limited resources.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of trust. It takes time and effort to build trust, especially in communities that have been traumatized by violence and broken promises.
It's like they're trying to rebuild a shattered relationship.
Exactly. And then there's the enemy themselves. Boko Haram and ISWAP are constantly adapting their tactics, trying to counter the army's efforts.
So it's like a constant game of cat and mouse.
It is. The army has to be constantly vigilant, always one step ahead.
And then you throw in the political dynamics, the corruption, the instability in the region.
It makes things even more complicated. But despite all the challenges, the Nigerian army is showing that there's another way to fight terrorism, a way that goes beyond bombs and bullets.
It's a whole different way of thinking about warfare. It's about winning hearts and minds, about building trust, about addressing the root causes of conflict.
You got it.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, but the big question remains, is it working?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one we'll explore further in the next part of our deep dive.
So stay tuned because we're just getting started. Wow, I don't know about you, but just listening to all that in the first part, it really hits home just how complex this whole situation is.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
It is. And for me, one of the things that just sticks out is the humanitarian crisis that's happening right alongside the conflict. Millions of people displaced. It's hard to even wrap your head around it.
It really is. And it just adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing, right? We
Mhm.
talk about rebuilding trust and giving people second chances. But imagine trying to do that while also dealing with a humanitarian disaster of this scale.
Yeah, it's got to be this constant balancing act, right? You're trying to fight Boko Haram on one hand, and then on the other hand, you're trying to rebuild the lives of the people who are caught in the crossfire.
Exactly. And it's easy to get caught up in the military and strategic stuff, but we can't forget that this is all about people, real people who have lost so much, their homes, their livelihoods, their sense of security.
It's heartbreaking.
It is.
And you know what's really striking is that it's the Nigerian army that's stepping up to provide a lot of that vital support. I mean, they're providing food, shelter, medical care, education. It's like they're trying to create some kind of normalcy amidst all this chaos.
Absolutely. And I think it speaks volumes about their commitment. They could easily just focus on the military objectives, but they're going above and beyond because they recognize that security and humanitarian aid, they go hand in hand.
It makes you wonder how they manage it all, though, right? Especially with the limited resources we talked about.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, imagine trying to coordinate all of that, distributing aid in a conflict zone, the security risks alone. It's a massive undertaking.
It's like they're running a military campaign and a massive relief operation at the same time.
And they're doing it out of a sense of duty to their people. But even with the best intentions, they would be totally overwhelmed trying to do it all alone.
That's where those partnerships come in, though, right? The ones we were talking about before, working with civilian authorities, with NGOs, and getting that international support, it's all got to be crucial.
It's a perfect example of what they call the whole-of-society approach. You've got local leaders who provide insights, NGOs bringing in their expertise, and then international partners who can offer financial and logistical support.
It's like a giant puzzle where every piece is needed to see the full picture.
Exactly. And I think while we're on the subject of those key pieces, it's worth highlighting the incredible role that organizations like the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders play in all of this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They're often the ones who are right there on the front lines, providing medical care and other really vital services in the most dangerous areas.
And they often have a much deeper understanding of the local context, the cultural sensitivities. Those are the things that can truly make or break a humanitarian mission.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It's about having the right people on the ground with the right knowledge and experience.
100%.
Hmm.
It's finding that balance, and those NGOs are a huge part of making that happen.
It almost feels like there's this global recognition now that the fight against terrorism in Nigeria, it's not just a Nigerian problem. It's something that needs a global solution.
And that's where I think those non-kinetic approaches become even more crucial.
Yeah.
The community engagement, the counter-narratives, the rehabilitation programs, it's all part of a larger strategy to get to the core of what's causing this conflict.
And it seems like you just can't overstate the impact of that humanitarian aid either. It's about showing compassion, building resilience, and giving people a reason to hope for something better.
Exactly. Like we said, security and humanitarian aid, you can't have one without the other.
But we got to be real here. Even with all of this effort, all these different groups working together, it's still a really, really tough situation, right?
Without a doubt. I mean, we've already talked about the challenges, the lack of resources, the difficulty of building trust, and the fact that they're facing a very resilient enemy. Those are still very real and present issues.
Yeah. And then you add in the political stuff, the instability, the corruption. It sometimes feels like they're trying to build something solid on ground that's constantly shifting.
That's a good way to put it. But even with all of that going on, the Nigerian army is showing that progress can be made. They're
Yeah.
proving that these non-kinetic approaches, they can actually make a difference.
They're showing the world that there's a different way to fight terrorism, a way that goes beyond just brute force.
A way that takes into account how complicated this problem is and that looks for solutions that actually get to the heart of the matter.
And they're doing it with a level of resilience and determination that's really inspiring. But you know what really brings all of this to life for me? It's hearing the stories of the individuals who have been impacted by this conflict. Like the story of Binta, the woman who became the army's eyes and ears on the ground after they earned her trust.
That's a powerful one. And then there's the story of Musa, the former Boko Haram fighter, who was able to find redemption through Operation Safe Corridor. These are the stories that really make this whole thing hit home, the ones that show how these efforts are actually playing out in people's lives.
Exactly. We need to hear those stories. We need to understand what's at stake and how these non-kinetic approaches are actually changing things for people on the ground.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the final part of our deep dive. We're going to shift our focus to the personal side of all of this, the voices of the people who are right there in the thick of it.
So stay tuned because it's going to get real. Welcome back. You know, we've spent the last two parts digging into the strategies and the challenges of this whole non-kinetic warfare thing, but now it's time to really get personal. We're going to hear from some of the people whose lives have been directly impacted by all of this.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in all the big picture stuff, the policy and the tactics, but at the end of the day, this is about people. Real people's lives are being shaped by what the Nigerian army is doing.
So let's start with a story that really highlights just how powerful it can be to build trust at the grassroots level. Have you heard of Binta?
Benta's story is incredible, isn't it? I mean, she lives in this small village in northeast Nigeria, a region that's been just devastated by Boko Haram.
Yeah, and her village was living under this constant fear, never knowing when the next attack might come.
Right, imagine that, living with that kind of uncertainty every single day. You can't let your kids play outside. You don't even feel safe in your own home.
It's just terrifying. So, how did Binta go from living in that kind of fear to actually helping the army fight back?
Well, it all started when the army decided to try a different approach. Instead of just coming in with overwhelming force, they made a real effort to engage with the community.
So, like, what were they doing differently?
They held these town hall meetings. They actually sat down and listened to people's concerns, their fears. They were trying to show that they genuinely cared about what the villagers were going through.
So, it wasn't just about gathering intel, it was about building those relationships.
Exactly. And it wasn't easy. Binta, like a lot of the villagers, she was skeptical at first.
Why should she trust them? I mean, she'd seen so much violence, so many promises broken.
Exactly. But the army, they were persistent. They kept coming back, they kept listening, and they kept showing that they were committed to protecting the community. And little by little, Binta started to believe them.
So her skepticism started to fade, and she actually began to trust them.
It was a gradual process, for sure. But eventually, she became one of the Army's most valuable assets.
How so?
She became their eyes and ears on the ground. She would share information with them, anything she thought might be helpful. She'd report suspicious activity, relay rumors she heard in the market, things like that.
Things that might seem small, but could actually be really important pieces of the puzzle.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And you know what? Her tips, they actually helped the Army stop several planned attacks.
So she was actually saving lives.
That's right. Binta's story, it just goes to show that when you take the time to build trust at the local level, it can have a real impact on the fight against terrorism.
It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the best way to fight an enemy isn't with force, but with empathy and understanding. But what about those who have already been involved with Boko Haram, those who have already crossed that line? Is there any coming back from that?
Yeah, that's a tough question. But I think the story of Musa gives us some hope.
Oh yeah, Musa, the former Boko Haram fighter, right.
That's him. You see, Musa, he got recruited as a teenager, just a kid, really. He was drawn in by all the promises, adventure, belonging, making a difference.
It's really tragic how these groups exploit young people like that.
It is. They prey on their vulnerabilities, their desire for something more. But for a lot of these kids, the reality of life in Boko Haram, it's nothing like what they were promised.
So what happened to Musa? How did he get out?
Well, over time, he just became more and more disillusioned with the group. I mean, the brutality, the violence, it was just too much.
He realized it wasn't what he signed up for.
Right. And eventually, he made the incredibly brave decision to surrender to the Nigerian Army.
Wow, that must have taken a lot of courage.
Absolutely. It was a huge risk.
Yeah.
But he knew he had to get out. And that's when he encountered Operation Safe Corridor, the program we were talking about earlier.
The one that focuses on rehabilitating and reintegrating former combatants.
Yeah, that's the one. For Musa, it was a lifeline. He went through counseling to help him deal with the trauma, the things he had seen and done.
Because leaving the group is just the first step, right? There's a whole lot of healing that needs to happen after that.
Exactly. But Musa, he was determined to turn his life around. He learned carpentry through the program, which not only gave him a way to support himself, but also gave him a sense of purpose, something to be proud of.
So he was able to build a new life for himself.
He was. It wasn't easy. There was still a lot of mistrust to overcome, but he was persistent, and eventually he was able to reintegrate back into his community.
So both Binta and Musa, their stories show us that there's hope, even in the midst of all this conflict.
I think so too. They're a testament to the power of building trust, offering second chances, and really believing in the possibility of change.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I think the thing that really sticks with me is this idea that the fight against terrorism, it's not just about military might. It's about winning hearts and minds. It's about addressing the root causes of the conflict. And it's about helping people rebuild their lives.
I couldn't agree more. It's a multifaceted challenge that demands empathy, understanding, and a long-term commitment to building a more peaceful future.
And sometimes the most effective solutions aren't the ones that involve bombs and bullets, but the ones that focus on building trust, fostering dialogue, and offering hope. It's in those stories of individual resilience, stories like Binta's and Musa's, that we can find the true path towards lasting peace. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.